Charlie Pedlar, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
No, my pleasure. The first person ever to sit in a podcast recording studio.
Oh,
so you've gone to the
Well, it's worth doing something. It's worth doing it properly, isn't it? You know.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'm very jealous as well because I would love that of my own. But anyone that doesn't know who you are, Charlie, would you mind just giving us a brief background about you?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a sports scientist. Physiology would be the main discipline within that. I've worked in high performance sport ever since I did my master's degree back in Wolverhampton back in the day. I suppose I've been involved more on the endurance side in the early part of my career, and then as I've gone through more towards team sports. Physiology would be the main sort of umbrella thing. I have a PhD, so I studied altitude training in endurance athletes, and specifically how well athletes sleep when they go to and from altitude and try and sleep in altitude tents and those kinds of things. So that's kind of where it all started for me. But over the years got involved in lots of different areas of sports science and physiology, and more recently blood biomarkers has been a big theme, and the female athlete has been a big theme. The great thing about sports science is that it can go in so many different directions, and so broad interests.
So you've got an academic role,
yes,
as well as a commercial role.
Yes.
Just explain those to us and how they kind of work together and dovetail nicely.
Yeah, so I spend half my time working for St Mary's University in Twickenham, and that's mainly research oriented. Delivering on grants, supervising PhD students, that kind of thing. And then half my time is working for Orico as a chief science officer, and there we work with professional athletes, mostly team sports athletes, English Premier League, American athletes like NBA and so on. And again, it's tracking biomarkers is the main business, but there's a range of things around that in terms of sort of advanced bioanalytics, we would call it in pro sports, and pulling together data into usable formats and advising athletes on how to stay healthy and trying to keep them on doing what they love doing and what they're good at, which is obviously performing and entertaining. So I split my time between those two roles.
Where does, just on the Orico side, where does that fit in terms of all the other tech and providers that clubs are inundated with?
Yes.
We spoke about GPS just a minute ago before we click record. Where does that fit?
Yeah, well, I suppose the unique offering with Orico has been the biomarkers, and so that remains the case. So I would say we're one of the leaders in particularly tracking recovery. So Orico actually means golden recovery. So OR is gold in Irish, and RECO recovery. So the whole idea was to try and optimize recovery as being the most of the training adaptations are occurring during recovery. So point of care blood tests and venous blood draws periodically as well. But then also the other big side of the company is the data analytics side. So Professor John Newell over at NUIG in Galway leads a team of data scientists and statistical scientists to actually use things like GPS data and camera data to then unlock phenomenal information around predicting, or not predicting, that's not the right word, but assessing injury risk and insights that the naked eye wouldn't be able to necessarily see. So pulling all of that together, and like many of these providers, as you say, they're trying to put together a whole load of contextual data via API connections and produce dashboards that kind of do everything. And actually, Orico is no different in that sense. But I'd say it's unique. Its unique elements are science-driven, biomarker-driven, and then it's the data analytics side.
Very good. Well, I mean, the crux of the conversation for the next 45, 50 minutes is going to be around the the female
Yeah.
athlete, performance and health. And one of your colleagues, Georgie, came on the podcast 2021-ish, I think. And this was one of the questions that I asked her right at the start. And it's around breaking down of barriers on this particular topic. And I haven't listened back to what she said, but I'd be interested too. But what's your take on what barriers need to be broken down on this topic? But not only that, from this point of view of August 2024, but how have those developed and been broken down, hopefully, maybe since that, even the last 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, Matt, I think we've seen huge changes. It's always difficult to assess in the kind of social media world we live in, when we're kind of in our own bubbles, our own echo chambers and so on. But I think it feels to me like female sport has really turned a corner. And I think a landmark for that was the World Cup, the Women's World Cup football last year. But I think, going back to breaking down barriers and Georgie. So Georgie was as a colleague of mine and friend, and I'm probably going to say similar things to her. I'd like to think I would, because we've been working together for a long time, and she really pushed me to kind of explore this area when we started working together a few years ago. And so if you imagine me as a male sports scientist working in a physiology lab and out in the field with female athletes as much as with male athletes, I'm really sort of not giving due consideration to female physiology. So we would, athletes would come and come into the lab, and we'd do monitored treadmill sessions and so on. And occasionally, an athlete would pull up and say, I've got some symptoms. It's time of the month or whatever. I'm cramping or whatever it might be. And we would kind of just brush that under the carpet and say, don't worry, we'll stop the session there and come back. But we never really explore it further. And it was Georgie really that sort of pushed me on that front, because we were doing work around, we were screening athletes for iron deficiency, screening athletes for vitamin D deficiency and so on. And so we were working a lot on optimizing things like that, but we weren't really paying attention to the menstrual cycle and the fact that there's this cyclical hormones that are then going to influence not only your physiology and, how you feel, but also, you're going to have these symptoms that are going to actually potentially, be debilitating in some cases. And first of all, we have to say up front, there's going to be a huge range here. So some athletes are not going to really experience very much at all, and they're going to be able, the lucky ones, I guess, are going to be able to get away training as normal, similar to a man with, fairly similar physiology day to day, whereas some female athletes are really significantly affected by quite significant symptoms. So simply, Georgie was like, well, let's start tracking some of this stuff. Let's look at the physiology and see when are these symptoms occurring, what's the physiology looking like at different phases in the menstrual cycle, and let's simply start to monitor when it occurs. And of course, it's so cyclical, by definition, that you can then start to predict what's going to happen and actually work around that where you need to. And that's a smart way to train, is to learn about your body, learn about how it reacts and responds, and then use that information to your advantage going forwards. So that's kind of how it started. And I think breaking down the barriers, so male physiologists, male sports scientists like myself wouldn't go near that kind of thing. The conversations are just too awkward. We're not confident enough to understand the complex physiology and be able to really advise effectively. And it's much easier just to say, actually, no, we're just going to bury our head in the sands and ignore that. But that's definitely changed. And there's now great resources, great tools available for male and female sports scientists and coaches to use to help female athletes. So we're in a much better place, I think. Although there's still a lot to do, we're a much better place than we have been, certainly in the UK.
I can't let you say about the iron deficiency and vitamin D, without exploring that a little bit further. Just explain to us how common that is and what's that going to potentially lead to in terms of health and performance. Yeah,
so iron deficiency is extremely prevalent in female athletes in particular, because they have cyclical losses of blood each month. And so we have trouble absorbing iron from food. We have trouble absorbing it even from supplements. There's only so much we can absorb each day. And where we have an imbalance between the amount of iron we're losing through these menstrual blood losses and other causes as well, we can get into a state of iron deficiency. And then from there, we can get into a state of anemia. And so, I explained that I started off with, mainly with endurance athletes. As soon as you get an athlete who's coming towards an anemic state, they really can't perform on an endurance with an endurance performance, because it's directly affecting their oxygen carrying capacity and their VO2 max. And so once you take away that aerobic capacity, once you reduce the aerobic power, you just can't perform until you get fatigue, and you get athletes wondering why they're not able to perform. So simply monitoring iron deficiency and then addressing that with supplementation. In extreme cases, addressing that with an iron injection. Where you can't seem to get on top of it with supplementation was a common thing for us to have to work with endurance athletes. So, and we started doing. Richard Burden was my first PhD student in this area to start looking at iron deficiency, and we started to explore this in much more detail. And then Georgie's work came in, and we started to look at heavy menstrual bleeding as a group that were at an even higher risk of iron deficiency. And it was that, when we were looking for the heavy menstrual bleeders for research studies, that then opened the big, can of worms of the menstrual cycle. And that's really started that kind of work. But yeah, I think iron deficiency is a really common issue. It's really important for female athletes to be aware of it. And it's easily corrected. So it's something that, particularly athletes doing a high volume of training, going to and from altitude on training camps, and other risk factors like being vegetarian as well, mean that it's something that we need to really keep on top of.
What's it like in non-competing women?
Still common, but endurance athletes and athletes in general are going to be at a higher risk because you have this higher demand for iron. So iron is you consume iron when you're producing red blood cells, and so a big part of endurance training is to produce more red blood cells. And when you go to high altitude, you have the low oxygen environment that stimulates erythropoietin to then produce more red blood cells. So we then have higher demand on iron, but that doesn't exist in the normal population, although it can still be a problem if you haven't got adequate dietary intake, if you're losing a lot of blood each month, and your kind of general exercise and so on will also cause, or you will still have a higher prevalence than males. It's not completely absent in males, but it's very rare to have iron deficiency anemia occurring in a male athlete.
So let's take it back to the mapping of the menstrual cycle, like you mentioned there. And there is tools out there that enable female athletes to do that, or just females in general to do that. Can you just talk to us a little bit about how difficult or easy that is and the tools that are available?
Yeah. So and this is one of those areas where you've got very, very simple tools all the way through to really, really complex, more research-oriented type tools. And there's more and more options, but I think the first thing is just simply recording when your menstrual cycle occurs. So we just call that like calendar or keeping a menstrual cycle diary. And obviously, then you can start doing that with electronic methods. There's there's apps and so on available to help you do that. The next thing would be to then measure ovulation, because that gives you a time point, another time point, rather than just waiting for this menstrual cycle bleed to occur. You've got another time point with ovulation test kits. So those are usually urine tests that athletes can use, and that gives you then a slight, a bit more accuracy around the menstrual cycle length and characteristics. And then you start to move into things like blood tests for progesterone, estrogen, and you can, that becomes more invasive. There is an idea that you can do that with saliva, although it's probably less accurate in that, you get very, very low levels of estrogen, for example, in saliva. And then there's a range of other sort of tools like temperature tracking. That is one. So Oura rings and things can measure skin temperature, but you can also do core body temperature measurements with various tools that will then be surrogates of measuring ovulation or working out what phase you're in. So you can imagine there's a huge space in fertility, and lots of giant companies trying to help women get pregnant, and they're quite they're masters of this of tracking things like ovulation, and so we're probably borrowing some tools from there and applying them in sport. But I'd say the most common one is looking at, or the most common wearable method for this is probably looking at changes in body temperature, and like I say, you can do that with Oura rings or with other devices.
I'm actually wearing as we speak. Not that I've got a menstrual cycle to track.
Yeah.
But interesting. So, but what's the accuracy like when it comes to something like the Oura ring?
Yeah, pretty good. I mean, there's you have to remember it's skin temperature, and it's not measuring core temperature or basal metabolic temperature. You've got some variability with that, depending on if you imagine you sleep with your hand under your duvet or out of your duvet, that might adjust the data slightly, because it's nocturnal temperatures which are going to be the most accurate for this. So actually measuring it during sleep. But yeah, it's been shown to be about I think it's about 80% accurate. So there's good data on that now, and you're talking about quite small changes in skin temperature that are occurring, but it does seem to be fairly robust in terms of detecting those changes phase to phase.
Because the individuality of symptoms, and just going back again, just as I'm kind of getting excited about the potential of this conversation, because there's so much to go into. Because of the individuality of it, is that made it more difficult from a research perspective to actually, I'm just thinking about my past life in team sports. Because it's so individual, has it made research difficult to actually provide recommendations, because there is so many different symptoms and times and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. And there's that complexity that we've just started to skim the surface of, but you've got a portion of the population who's going to have what we call a eumenorrheic cycle, which is a normal menstrual cycle, 21 to 35 days. And then, that's probably, it could be kind of half the athletes that you work with, or it could be more than that. Then you've got a proportion of that who are going to be using hormonal contraception. So exogenous hormones to help regulate a menstrual cycle. Then you've got a range of dysfunctions. So anything from this heavy menstrual bleeding that we've talked about all the way through to complete loss of the menstrual cycle. And there's certain sports that's going to be more prevalent than others, particularly endurance sports, aesthetic sports, where keeping a low body mass, keeping a low fat mass is important for aesthetic reasons. And so losing a menstrual cycle is quite common in that group. Then around that you've got individual sensitivity. So we're talking about a cyclical variation, two major hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone. We've got receptors for those hormones throughout our physiology. Some of those things are going to be, it means pretty much any system can be influenced by these hormones, but then you're going to have a range of kind of symptoms that are going to accompany that are going to be very different between individuals. And then one of the challenges that we've had is actually linking the symptoms to the menstrual cycle, because symptoms can occur for other reasons too. You can have heavy legs because of training you did yesterday, or you can have heavy legs because you're slightly maybe some water retention or something that's related to the menstrual cycle that can change that perception. So linking symptoms to the menstrual cycle has been difficult, and also things like psychological effects on anxiety or mood changes that can then have secondary effects like, feeling nauseous and or even, when one extreme athlete we worked with, would regularly vomit as as a symptom of their menstrual cycle, or linked. It was so cyclical, it was clearly related to the menstrual cycle. But you have direct and indirect effects of the menstrual cycle. So it's really difficult to pin down on. I think, like everything, athletes, it's an N of one. You work with your own physiology as much as you can, and learn how different things respond. And it's amazing how what we've seen with athletes is when you start talking about this, and athletes start sharing experiences, and they start learning about what's going on, then it can be a huge breakthrough. This is something I really feel passionate about. That if you can. You can go along for years with your kind of like not like aware that there's something happening, but not trying to get a handle on it or trying to understand it. But then you see this penny drop in athletes where they're like, okay, yeah, that's occurring then. So now I know that it can actually be incredibly encouraging, or it can help an athlete to get through phases where they might have a lot of symptoms, because they know they know what's causing it, they know it's temporary, and they can sort of relax, work their way through it, and even put in place strategies to help avoid it. And then it can be a real game changer. And if you can get this right in young athletes, then working through a career, they might have something like 400 to 500 menstrual cycles across their career. And so it's something that is not only going to help them when they're an athlete, it's going to help them throughout that period of fertility. Once you get towards menopause, the game changes again. But at least during that time, you can this education, this understanding can really help athletes to have a better life, as well as perform better. So,
if there is coaches and sports scientists and physios out there that are working with girls that have a loss of menstrual cycle, what issues can that cause? What can they do about it? Where would you point them?
Yeah. So the loss of the menstrual cycle is a major health flag, really. Now, we do expect athletes to see some variability in their cycle length, which is going to occur due to external factors. It's going to occur because of training. It's going to occur because of environmental factors, pressure, psychological pressure. It's really important to understand that the brain is controlling this through the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. So the physiology is linked directly to the brain. So all these factors that the brain is experiencing, it's going to then manifest in variations and alterations in the menstrual cycle. But where you see a prolonged periods of times with no menstrual cycle, so a loss of those cyclical hormones, then that's a red flag for really getting checked out. We go first of all to go to your doctor, and then they might refer you on for gynecological assessments and so on. But I mean, I think the important thing is to not normalize that kind of physiology, because it is a flag for poor health. And what can happen is you start to then lose things like bone mass can start to decrease, which is absolutely critical for long-term health, and as well as a host of other issues that can arise as a result of losing those cyclical hormone fluctuations.
So, in terms of a more general health screening, would there be anything that you do or you would recommend those working with female athletes to get and go through, whether it's bringing in expertise or going through it internally?
Well, we've spent time developing screening tools if you have a cohort of athletes, it's quite useful to know within that cohort how many of the athletes are naturally cycling, how many are amenorrheic, how many have got dysfunctions, how many are on hormonal contraception, and also if some of on more individual basis, things like their reproductive history, like age of onset of menarche, menstrual cycle, the commencement of menstrual cycles, family history, So all of that around this kind of female health physiology, you can.
Sorry to interrupt, Charlie.
Yeah.
What family history? What part can that play?
So if you have a young athlete coming into it, who we tend to see a lot more issues at the onset of the menstrual cycle. So around puberty, when athletes are starting their menstrual cycle, it can be more erratic. It can be more. You have more symptoms occurring. It can be more severe. And if you, it can sometimes be helpful to look at what about the mother. Did they have the same kind of experiences, and then what point did that diminish, and so on? Because it can then inform what's likely to happen with this, with this particular athlete. So that is something that is a lot of these things are passed on because we're very similar to our parents in terms of in this particular area. So yeah, that's one element of screening that we will, if you're going into a lot of detail, that you can look into. The other thing around health screening, like we mentioned, iron deficiency. So screening for iron, I'd say that is a female specific issue that it's worth. I think all female athletes really should be screened for iron, periodically, because it's so common. So the challenge is then that you're faced with, say you do start asking all those questions, you do need to then be able to advise effectively how athletes might want to change things or what strategies they might be able to use. And so not all teams and coaches and sports scientists are going to be equipped for that. So that is a service that Orica offers, is to go into teams in sports clubs, screen, and then advise on and provide sort of some individual strategies around it. And obviously, the more resources these teams have, the more they can go into the detail and have one-to-one consultations with athletes to help put together really bespoke strategies. And you might, you get that in some of the top, Olympic level or, world-class athletes. They'll have that kind of one-to-one service.
My next point was around training and moving this along. Do we know enough at this moment in time to be able to make training recommendations based on time within the cycle? And then again, looking back on my past life in team sports, how difficult is that to integrate within when you've got 20 girls or 25 girls? Just talk to us a little bit about that, and if we're at a point where we can actually do that right now, and if we should do that, even think about doing that.
I think it's a really interesting question, and one that's been I think there's been a bit of controversy around this, because the media tend to pick up on headlines and say, well, this study found this, therefore everyone needs to do this, and it's just simply not possible to do that. So I think it's absolutely right to challenge this idea that there's blanket recommendations for all female athletes is just not particularly sensible. That said, the physiology is pretty well established, and if you go back to the basics of why do we have this menstrual cycle, well, it's to prepare the body for reproduction, and essentially pregnancy. And if there's no pregnancy occurring, then we have to shed the endometrial lining. We have to basically start again each month, and so that is a dramatic change in the physiological environment. So that's going to have some kind of impact in many athletes on how they feel and the sort of symptoms that we've talked about, but also then the environment that they're then trying to train in as well. So it can be, it's logical to think, well, there's a period of time, usually phase 1 and 2, where the athlete's going to be feeling better and able to do more things and get more out of their body than there is in the luteal phase, the second half of the cycle, and certainly towards the end in what we call phase 4, then there can be quite debilitating symptoms that can then reduce training. So there are some kind of strong theories about how you might then want to adjust your training. But like I said, I think you have to really look at this on an individual basis and work out what are you trying to achieve from your training, and can we actually timetable it around the menstrual cycle to take advantage of it. And there are some studies that have done that, some research studies that have done that successfully, although it's so hard to control all the variables. So yeah, there's that part of it that no, we shouldn't just give out blanket advice, but at the same time, let's look at the physiology. Let's think, well informed going into those conversations. And then if you have a team of athletes, I think this is the bit that people have shied away from. I think it is relatively simple to change training for a team of athletes. If you've got a good map of what's happening in terms of the menstrual cycle, in terms of symptoms, there's no reason why all athletes have to do exactly the same training every day. So you can easily have a group that sits out and does something different. And so I know that Georgie's done this really successfully at Chelsea and other places where I know that they'll have groups that will shift from a intense drill session or whatever it might be into a more simple aerobic, like recovery type session. And they'll simply just organise themselves in a way that they can do that. So I don't think it has to be overly complicated once you've got a good map. But it's one of those that you need to be on top of. You've got to constantly be met by understand where everyone's at, what they're doing, what sort of symptoms are occurring, and so on. So and teams are doing some phenomenal work around the world, really, in working out what works best in their environment and how they can accommodate this. So it's not just everyone does the same training every day, which is it might be easier organisationally, but it's probably not the most productive.
I should have asked this question before I asked the previous one, but the cycles, would you mind just mapping that out for us, just so we get a basic understanding of what is cycle 1, how it differs to, what is phase 1, how that differs to phase 4, for example?
Yeah, so you can, so you start off, the cycle restarts around, with the menstrual cycle bleed, and that's the kind of really clear landmark that you get each cycle. The beginning of the menstrual cycle phase is characterized by then an increase in estrogen that the beginning of, and that remains high for approximately 2 weeks. And then dips towards the second half of the cycle, the latter two stages, at which point progesterone, which has been very, very low, increases and becomes dominant in the second half of the cycle. So you can kind of divide up the menstrual cycle into these 4 phases, which is your bleed phase 1, and then phase 2 is this estrogen dominant phase. Phase 3 is then post ovulation. You've got your luteal phase and your progesterone dominance, and then phase 4 is your premenstrual window, where you tend to get a lot of symptoms where you're shedding the endometrial lining and restarting the whole system. So you get dramatic changes in hormones occurring at that time. Estrogen dips right down at that point, and so that can be noticeably different kind of day to day and how you feel. So that's the 4 phases is the typical model, although you can divide it into 2 phases, 3 phases, 4 phases, all the way up to about 7 phases if you want to. So it's kind of dependent on how much detail you want to go into and which kind of guide you're following. But there's some good resources out there to help you map the menstrual cycle and understand those kind of components.
Before we go, in 15-20 minutes, I'm going to ask you about the resources. So I'm telling you to pass the book on to you to remember, or at least two minds are better than one, hopefully. I'll ask you about the resources. So in terms of training which is best fit within each of those phases, or the opposite is best not to fit within each one of those phases, just going through those phases again, what do we know about that, or do we not know enough?
Well, so the role of estrogen, so let's look at that first phase.
Yeah.
The role of estrogen is about proliferation and growth. As you're rebuilding this the endometrium. So at that, as a result of that, you'll have estrogen is important for things like bone mineral density improvements as well. So it has that role, but also fat deposition occurs as a result of estrogen, and then we have a slight increase in metabolic rate. So you have these specific effects of estrogen occurring in the first half of the cycle. In the second half, we have increased fat oxidation, and we're preparing the uterus for pregnancy, and then the shedding occurs. So in terms of training, really there's a more of a anabolic type environment that's likely to be present in the first half of the cycle, whereas in the second half of the cycle there might be a slight better kind of endurance propensity with this increased fat oxidation. So there's those kind of broadly different physiological environments at the beginning and the end, but then I think around the more specific phases where phase 4, for example, symptoms are going to get in the way of training. So that's where you might park some of or modify your goals around that kind of time, focus more on recovery, let that happen before you move on again. So I think there's those kind of broad brush changes that you can expect across the menstrual cycle. But we did some work looking at strength training and looking at whether or not doing that, modifying that by phase would actually lead to greater outcomes. And actually, we didn't find much evidence, but other reviews have found, some effects. And I think what is frustrating about this area is that you imagine lining up all your responses in an individual on a graph or something. You'll see some that respond really well, and others that just show no effect, or something goes the opposite direction. And what we tend to do is look at all the studies here as looking for the cohort effect, like what's the overall effect, and of course it cancels out. So I think when we're studying this, we need to be better at finding the people that seem to respond well and studying them. And exactly the same with symptoms, like finding the group that are really struggling with symptoms and say, well, how can we address it? So I'd like to see research papers that say we took 50 people that all suffered with significant menstrual cycles and looked at how we could help them, rather than getting a big cohort study and saying, look, we found no consistent effects, or because within a cohort you do get so much variation that it's gonna cancel out some of those individual responses. I've gone off on one there a little bit, but
no, that's great. It's brilliant. It's super interesting. Just another caveat in there is nutrition. So not only training across the cycle, but how does nutrition affect things? How can nutrition help things?
Yeah, and this is one that's I think there's some nice review. Abby Smith Ryan over in North Carolina has done some really nice work, really documenting evidence for nutritional variations, and sort of things to consider that might relate to the cycle. And it's to do with things like the fat oxidation that I mentioned. It's to do with the fact that towards the end you're in a very much an inflammatory phase. So can you actually help by increasing anti-inflammatory foods? And I think there may well be a kind of interaction here which is really important. I think one thing that we've always said is, like, if you know you're in this pro-inflammatory phase towards the end of the menstrual cycle, then consuming pro-inflammatory foods at the same time is probably not going to be that helpful. So things like that can probably are is good advice, but there's not the number of studies and strong evidence that you would want to see around changes in your diet influencing performance or symptoms. I think it's the same. It's a bit like the recovery science space as well. That the big hitters here are going to be training volume, sleep quality, and just generally getting the right nutritional, like macronutrients and so on board. Other elements, if you start manipulating other elements, it's going to have probably a smaller effect that again might be important in some cases. There might also be a strong placebo effect, But I think the recent one, I suppose what I'm saying is that the research is relatively sparse. And you're really just looking for things that athletes, they want to be able to do something to help, and so something like nutritional strategies is really an attractive way to go.
And the big question across all this is around injury risk and whether that increases at particular time points across the cycle. Again, do we know enough to say anything around this?
So there was quite a lot of early work, well, not early work, but there was a study, I think a summary review done until 2007 that seemed to suggest that ACL injuries or ligamentous injuries occurred more commonly in the first half of the cycle. We actually have shown recently that muscle injuries, certainly where we've looked into this, again, it's relatively small studies, but longitudinally tracking, I think we had 22 WSL players, and we showed a much higher rate of muscle injuries occurring towards the end of the menstrual cycle. So there are some patterns there. I think how you sort of summarize it into a kind of like, here's what you need to know about injuries and menstrual cycle, I think that's really hard to do. But I think with what we know about the female hormones, what we know about things like changes in ligament laxity occurring around specific phases of the cycle, and also the fact that there's receptors throughout physiology, I think it sort of points to an important role for female hormones. But I think there's more work to do in this area, and there's bigger studies. And what we really need is to be systematically collecting menstrual cycle data with every injury that occurs, so we can really understand like what's the environment that injury has occurred in, what's the physiological environment, and then we would be much better. And I think the governing bodies and medical organisations and so on, they're starting to take note of that, and not just asking like when was your last period. They're actually asking what, are you on hormonal contraception? What day of the menstrual cycle are you on? These kinds of things that, how regular is your menstrual cycle? These sorts of things that can really help us to understand this area better. So there's lots to do in that space, I think.
And I think before I let you go for the next certainly 5-10 minutes, I think it's my favourite question I'm going to ask you today around common myths. Debunk a few common myths around female health and performance. When I say 5-10 minutes, it probably could be half an hour, because I'm sure there's plenty. But what are the big ones that you come across and are constantly kind of pushing back on when seeing practitioners or researchers or just general public?
Yeah, I think some of the things that we've covered. I think the idea that there is a way to train around the cycle. Hopefully, I've kind of painted a picture that it's really quite murky in terms of what we understand, and and that individual variation is so huge. So that's sort of the one size fits all, and this is blanket recommendations. I think is a bit of a myth, but I think the terminology is the other one that's is always wrong. So people thinking that their period, you're getting mixed up with like menstruation, menstrual cycle, period, what exactly those things mean, and so we need to be more precise with that. But I think one thing that I would like athletes to do better, and I'm not sure if this is myth busting exactly, but I think there's a quite a common occurrence, not necessarily from the general public, but amongst practitioners, to put athletes on hormonal contraception early on to help them just deal with symptoms and so on. And that doesn't ever seem to be really properly thought out or trialed. And so we commonly come across athletes who have been put on hormonal contraception during puberty, and they've been on it for 5 years or more, not really knowing why they're doing it or what, but at some point they've been told that that's a good idea. So I think that's one that I think I would like to see kind of more, more sort of care taken around how we do that sort of thing. But I think the big one that we come across a lot is also and this is very cultural, is that athletes sitting out when they're on their period, and that being kind of almost like a golden rule that you can't train when you're on your period, or you can't perform when you're on your period. And I think there's some cultures where it's kind of, it's almost, it's almost like a religious belief that that's what you should do. And what we've tried to say with all our work, and this is where some of it might be misunderstood, but is that we're trying to help athletes perform any day of their cycle. So, regardless of where they're at, there's strategies we can put in place. There's work that we can do on a case-by-case basis with trial and error to really try and help athletes perform on any day of their cycle. So we're not about saying, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. It's like, yes, you can, but let's think intelligently about training, and let's try and get athletes arriving in, on the touchline, start line, or whatever, on the field in the best possible condition to perform. So that's an important one, I think.
Just so that finally on the hormonal contraception, what are the effects of been on that for 5-10 years? Is there any? Do we know?
Well, how many studies have really followed up long term the effects of these things? And you're manipulating a natural physiological process. So there's going to be different philosophies around this and different kind of idealized discussions around it. So we have to be a bit cautious. But I think the long term, we simply don't know what the long term effects are. What's clear is, from some of our biomarker monitoring work, we see higher inflammation in athletes that are using hormonal contraception. They stand out very clearly as being more inflamed, and that's been shown systematically that athletes on hormonal contraception tend to have a higher background inflammation. So that might be working against them over time. We know inflammation is a unifying factor of a lot of long-term disease states. So it can't be healthy to have a long period of time where you kind of have this background inflammation that you're dealing with on top of the stresses coming from sport. Same with oxidative stress. The biomarkers that we use to measure oxidative stress, those the female athletes on hormonal contraception stand out as a separate group with high oxidative stress. So I think there's a physiological impact of the hormonal contraception of the exogenous hormones that we're not fully appreciating when they're used continuously and it becomes a really prolonged thing. So I think think carefully about going on hormonal contraception, evaluate why you're doing it and what the impact might be, and then I think there's more to understand and more to kind of take into consideration when we're doing that sort of thing.
And my final question is, what's coming up for you in terms of the research area? What areas are you going to go into?
Well, I think one of the big areas is with the development of, or with the kind of breaking down the barriers and the emergence of higher profile female athlete teams. It means we've got more opportunity to do monitoring programs and so on with female athletes that we haven't historically been able to do, or that we've only done with males in the past. So there's a few WSL teams now, for example, that are doing the same biomarker monitoring programs that we've historically only done with male athletes, because they just haven't, the money hasn't been there. And so that's exciting, because it means we can really get a handle on some of these things, like iron deficiency, like oxidative stress, inflammation, dietary factors that might be important that we haven't been able to kind of look at before in this elite group. So I think there's been a maturation of this whole field as well. So there's been a lot of descriptive work. It's safe to say a lot of surveys that's gone out. They've gone out to athletes, and I think that's now becoming. The picture has emerged quite clearly about the proportion of athletes using hormonal contraception, the proportion of symptoms, what type of symptoms are most common, dysfunction, all these things. So we've got quite a nice handle on that. And so I think what we want to see going forwards, like I was alluding to before, was let's look at those individuals that are really having problems and try and put in place strategies and test those strategies. And so that's the way I would like to see it going forwards. But yeah, we've got research going on around sleep. We've got research going on around ethnicity, which is often ignored. We've got work around nutrition and symptoms. There's a whole range of things. So it's exciting times ahead for sure.
Amazing. And I knew I'd come back. I said I'd come back to it, and I've remembered for the first time ever resources that you'd point people towards in this area as a whole.
Yeah.
Including your own, of course.
Yeah.
Research and work.
Yeah. Well, I think it sort of depends on who you are, but I think for example, there's work that's really accessible and really kind of practical that people like Andrea Clark have done in Australia, looking at education programs, like free online resources. There's more and more kind of guides to how to approach the menstrual cycle. Claire Badenhorst in New Zealand has just published a paper all about menstrual cycle, female athlete. Sort of diagnosing what you have in your team and some clear definitions of what these various issues might be and what to do with them. I know Professor Kerry McGawley has been doing a lot of work around education and menstrual cycle literacy. So there's some names of people there that have put out some really nice work in terms of stuff that you can go and read around. But there's more and more education available for athletes to access, and there's also scientific resources for people like myself, sports scientists who want to know how to deal with or how to approach some of these challenges on a daily basis.
Amazing. Well, Charlie, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. But finally, if anyone wants to follow you on social media, are you a social media guy? Twitter guy?
Not hugely.
Okay.
No.
It's a good thing.
Let's not get into that. But I think no, if I'm anywhere, I'm on LinkedIn. So
okay.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
That's where I hang out the most.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and thank you for going to the effort to jump in the podcast studio. I'm still jealous that you've got that on tap.
Yeah.
But look forward to keeping in touch. Look forward to seeing where this space goes, and obviously your work. And we'll speak soon.
Great. Thanks, Rob.